is this all about? We know that we're here for a life experience. At the beginning, we thought we could just do whatever we wanted, but now we understand that, it's better to be on a good path, a spiritual path, a happy path. Life's still not easy, but it's a lot better when you realize drinking drugs is not going to get you there. It was a false vision that was sold to us. We're all going to be millionaires, we're all going to be gangsters, we're all going to, have the nice cars and that. It's not true. That, true happiness comes from within. It's something that you create, and that's what we need to get back to. You create your own happiness. It doesn't come from out here, and then whatever comes from out here is just a bonus. So we should all be living, a very spiritual, happy life.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Recovery Couch, where we deliver unapologetic, real, faith-based stories and messages covered by the blood of Jesus. This is a space where we speak from the heart, without filters, because Psalm 139 verse 4 reminds us that God knows our words before we ever speak them. Romans 5:8 tells us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's why the Recovery Couch exists, to meet people exactly where they are, because here, we believe when you offer someone a space to be real, you're also offering them a space to heal. Today's guest is Chris Hill, best-selling author of Get Your Life Back, The Road to Freedom from Addiction. After losing his twin brother Rob to an accidental overdose, Chris turned unimaginable pain into purpose through the Rob Hill Foundation. And Beat My Addiction, he has helped thousands of people find freedom from addiction, destructive habits, anxiety, and depression. His message is simple but powerful. Freedom is possible. So excited for today's conversation. Welcome to the show, Chris Hill. Chris, how you doing?
I'm good, Brandon. Thank you for inviting me on. Great to be here.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you, man. You're doing awesome work in this world. This is big deal work. And for some of the people out there who have a stigma attached to addiction, they don't understand that people in addiction are people too. And they're people that people love, and people who are just struggling to love themselves. So I know a little bit about your story, but why don't you tell the listeners kind of how you got into the recovery business?
I mean, I spent probably 20 years in addiction. Started from smoking at a young age, and then it was alcohol, and then that turned into recreational drugs. I don't know, we got caught up in the late 80s, early 90s with the ecstasy and the house music and stuff. And we just got sucked into that lifestyle. And I suppose as a youngster, I wasn't like a rebel, but I was always questioning, and so I was probably a bit disruptive at school and stuff. And so you get labelled quite quickly that you're never going to amount to anything. And to be honest, it didn't really bother me. I was having fun, drinking, taking drugs, doing whatever I was doing. But the unfortunate part, after many years, there's consequences. There's consequences to our behaviour when we drink. When you take cocaine or other drugs like that, our behaviour, the ability to make the right or wrong decisions goes out the window. And what we think is okay to do, it's not okay. And unfortunately, after 20 years, my mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, I was in a mess, an absolute mess, and we always go to the traditional services. We always go to the doctor first, go to the psychiatrist, go to counselling, I'm not saying that any of those are wrong. We all need some professional help, but my problem was a lot deeper. It just seemed to be somewhere where that they couldn't get me to. They could give me tablets, they could give me, I don't know, some basic, behavioural changes to make, but my problems existed within me. As much as it was a drink and drug problem, it was much as a mental health problem as well. And it's not that I was mentally ill, but there was something wrong, like my needs, my dependency, my behaviour was drawing me to do the things that were causing me harm. And really on that journey, I suppose it came to a point where I remember my mother-in-law, she gave me a book, and it was, I don't know if a guy called Alan Carr. It was like an easy way to stop smoking. It was a UK guy. And I read this book, and it was all to do with little monsters in the stomach, big monsters in the brain. And if you could starve the little monster to death, it would stop sending messages to the brain. And I remember reading this book once to stop smoking. And I was smoking maybe 40 cigarettes a day at the time. I just stopped. After umpteen times of just putting cigarettes out and just trying to will myself to stop. I just stopped, and it was a couple of days of a bit of uncomfortableness. But after that, I just lost the want and need to smoke, and it was almost like a miracle, I suppose. But I was still taking drink and drugs at the time, and so somewhere along the line, I've started to smoke again. But I thought it's not a problem because I can just go back to this book and the book will help me stop. But this time I read the book and it didn't work. And then I read the book again and it didn't work. And really that was what sent me on this journey of discovery. Like, how can I get back to, because ultimately what the book gave me was that inner peace. It was like it reset my brain back to who I was before I started to smoke. And so that was the beginning of a journey that I went on to try and find the route out of addiction. Now I had an experience of it, but at that time I couldn't get back. The method couldn't get me back. And then it's really just randomly one day I'd watched this film called The Matrix. Remember the film The Matrix?
Yeah.
And it's all to do with virtual reality worlds, futuristic, but it's just a science fiction film. But I watched the film and I remember it was like the following day, it was like this light bulb moment. It was like this self-realization that something similar was happening to me, that I was like an independent entity to how my mind and body were working. So it was like, I suppose the light bulb moment was like a disconnect. I was able to disconnect from how my mind and body were working to then be able to observe my thoughts, my feelings, and my emotions, which is ultimately where my drivers came from, that want and need. When I introduced a drug or a behavior or a habit or something that released chemicals in my brain that made me feel good, now what we understand is dopamine is a prehistoric mechanism to repeat behavior. I didn't really fully understand that at the time, but what I understood, that I was independent of the need, the want and need that came from inside of me. And it was just, as I said, this random science fiction film that almost, unlocked that key. It was the key that unlocked the box that allowed me into my brain, into my mind. And from understanding through the Alan Carr methods and other therapies and that, I understood that now I knew where my problem was, that I could then sit in my brain and start a communication. So, and that's really what I did. And, from teaching myself, we call it like a self-talk technique, I was able to open up a dialogue with my mind. And it takes, a week, 10 days. But after that, the mind went dormant, the same as what I understood with the cigarettes before. But this time the mind went dormant and I knew how it had gone dormant. And trust me, after that understanding, I went and tested it again and again, but it worked every single time. And eventually what I did is I got rid of all the drink and the drugs and the nicotine and everything else that I was taking. And I rebuilt my life, and I was doing really well, maybe 7 years into that. And then tragically, it's always like a long story, but I've got a couple of brothers, like an older brother and a twin brother. But tragically, my twin brother went out on a night out. We had a very similar story. And he went into rehab. He actually did like almost, I think it was about 18 months eventually in rehab to try and get off drinking drugs. But he came out and he was okay for a while, but he sort of slipped back a bit. He was actually working for me because once I got off drinking drugs, I started my own business, started a family. I did everything that everyone ever really, really wanted or needed. And then, we went out on a night out. He decided to take some ecstasy after 20 years of not taking ecstasy, but the body just wasn't ready for what it hadn't had for all of that time. And it got into his blood system and it shut his organs down and, tragically, like, he died, which you could understand for me was just completely life destroying. I think that was the first time I ever really contemplated suicide. I was just, I can't tell you that I'm the biggest religious person in the world, but I remember looking up from my bedroom in my bed and just thinking, look, I never signed up to this. This is not what I've signed up to. And I suppose at that point was the point, do I just give up? Do I just check out? Do I, but something inside of me, because I had a wife, a young child, there was something inside me saying, look, Chris, you got to stay. You have to stay, because you've got all of this information. You've got 6 years of recovery. You've overcome crack cocaine, alcoholism, smoking, mental health, trauma. But you've got it all in your head. It shouldn't be in your head. You need to put it. You need to be able to share it, to give. And so, it took me maybe 6 months just to try and get my head back together. I almost lost my business. I just fell apart. But I never went back to drink and drugs. I knew from what I'd understood, drink and drugs was never going to bring my brother back. It was never going to fix anything. In fact, after 20 years, it's not something that I want to experience again. But once I sort of got my head back into a space, I decided to write a book. I just started with a pen and a pad, and I just started to write. And because the whole point in writing was, I didn't want to lose my brother. I didn't want to lose, his existence. Like, he was a good person. Even though we get caught up in drink and drugs, we're still good people. We're not born into this world drug addicts. We're not born evil. We're born with a blank page. But some of us are served, you know, the way that we're brought up and stuff. People have good upbringings and not upbringing. I'm not saying we didn't have a good upbringing, but we were presented, society presented us with a lot of things. And back when we were young, smoking was normal, drinking was normal. It was just normalized. And so, it was presented, we took it, we enjoyed it. But the problem with having a mindset of, I don't know, the ability to question and push boundaries, take risks, which is what we did, you can get yourself into trouble. So, but coming back to the book, I just needed to keep his name alive, his memories alive. So I wrote this book. But then, whilst I was writing this book, or what came out of this book, I decided to write what we now call the 7-day beat addiction plan, which is really just the psychology around mental. It's not 7 days to beat your addiction, but it was. I wrote this booklet to say it takes around 7 days to prepare yourself for change, to be able to make that decision, to confidently say that from this moment on, for the rest of my life, I'm never going to do this again. Because the moment you write that down, the moment you sign that bit of paper, you are sending a message directly to where the mind exists, and saying, enough is enough. But that is what we call, it triggers like a conflict with your mind, because this is the thing, like, and I know you're a very spiritual person. We all understand that we're a soul, a spirit, we're the conscious self. We've been gifted this life, my mind, my body, the vessel, my mind is my guide and everything else. But the problem with the system, it's high intelligence, but there's no common sense. When I'm being driven to drink or take a drug or to smoke a cigarette, as much as I'm going to get satisfaction from it, the mind doesn't understand consequences, doesn't understand consequences of money, relationships, I don't know, stature in your community. It's almost like it's an animal instinct that is driven for survival. We must eat, we must drink, we must, breathe, we must sleep. Because addiction. There's no common sense in addiction. It sits with the prehistoric mind. I'm not saying the mind is prehistoric. The mind, animal like, but the mind is a prehistoric mechanism. It wasn't created for a modern day society. It was created back when I don't know, when we didn't have houses or trains or rockets that we could fly to the moon. It was a very basic model of survival. Same as, a fox, an animal. Every animal has an instinct, an instinct to procreate, to eat, to drink, to survive, to have fun. I mean, it shouldn't be a miserable life. So, but we're fighting all of these different things because we're born into a modern day society, and modern day society has got a slightly different plan for us. We're told to eat this, drink this, pop this, smoke this, sniff this. I know it's not like a government thing, but it's a societal thing. And in a society now, we're completely driven by addiction. If it's a cup of coffee, is it a chocolate biscuit, an ice cream, a national lottery ticket, your sports team. I'm not saying all of this is bad and we shouldn't participate in everything, but we should at least have the knowledge of why we do things. Where does our needs come from? Are those needs good or are they bad? We should be able to have a choice. But if we don't have this basic information, we call it the separation model, that I consciously, I spiritually, I the soul, I the decision maker, but I am independent of mind and body. No one's really explained that. Religion explains it perfectly, to be honest. Everything that I teach, when you look at religion and you look at what I teach, it's very, very, there really isn't a lot of difference. It's very, very similar. It's just that where I sit and how we teach it, we stay in the education and science. Like, we have to evidence what we teach. We have to evidence the separation model. We have to evidence the outcome. But sitting just over that line of where we go up to our faith, our religion is, are our beliefs. And I've had, look, many experiences, since losing my brother, like messages that have, that things have happened to me, and at that moment of that happening, something else happened, and the only way it could have happened, it was like my brother sending me a message just saying, I'm still here, keep going, giving me that inner strength to just keep pushing forward. The unfortunate part about what I do and how I help people in recoveries is there's a lot of sacrifice. People don't understand. Like, when I help someone, I don't just go, oh, there's a booklet, go and read it, and I'll see you next week. We physically have to go on that journey with them, and we have to stay on that path as long as it takes until that person, releases themselves from this trauma, this dependency, this addiction, so that they've got the tools to then go on and get on with their lives and stuff like that. So in a sort of roundabout way, that's what I do. And since then I've set up like a homeless charity. I've set up like a mental health charity to help people. I run, one-to-one clinics. We've just started like a coaching program where we're now teaching people how to coach, to become, a qualified coach, and then help people through lived experience through the process that we teach. Here in the UK, and I guess it is even worse in the US and stuff. Like, we are at epidemic levels. We've got a ketamine problem going on over here at the minute with the youngsters. It's 10 times cheaper than cocaine. It's destroying their bowels and their bladders. We've got the normality of alcoholism and the problems that brings. Cocaine use. It's just a free, it's almost like the war on drugs is over now. And because there's not enough money to try and fight it. I think they lost that war many years ago. And even to the fact that here, the NHS and other medical services now give out, ketamine, LSD, cannabis and stuff like that. I haven't got, to be honest, I have no problem with medical use. If someone needs something to heal or to recover, then give it to them. But there's not enough messaging on the other side of the consequence. Every drug comes with a side effect, whether it's paranoia, schizophrenia, whether it's behavioral change, whether it's violence, whether it's criminality. Unfortunately, the moment you drug the brain, then you get a different person. That conscious self, that pure essence of life is slightly distorted. We now have a distorted way that we see the world. And okay, maybe in a creative way it might aid people, but in general it's not good. I don't adhere to it. You know, what we teach people is to be in your natural state of being. The way that you were born into this world, we were equipped. We were equipped with emotion, feeling, thought. We had our aspirations. We had our imagination. We were equipped to manage. Even in a modern day society, we were equipped. But slowly, that child innocence is taken away because we smoke this, we drink this, we do. And we find other ways to satisfy, pleasure. But the problem with drink, drugs, and other substances and activities is is a quick fix with consequences. And really, what I've learned in life is if you want happiness, you have to work hard. You work hard for a result, not open a can and get an instant fix. A can of beer will tell you, peace, calm, and happiness. It says it on the tin. But what it doesn't tell you, it's going to extract your natural state of being, your personality, the people that are good around you. It doesn't say what it's going to extract, but that's the unfortunate part. So what we need is education to help, especially the youngsters, but society as a whole, that it's okay to be drug free. It's okay to live in your natural state. It's okay to be a spiritual being. It's okay to be good. You don't, and then you work out personally what's good and what's bad. I mean, and that's the model that we teach.
This episode of the Recovery Couch is brought to you by Greg Swartz at Remax Victory and Affiliates. Greg brings heart, hustle, and honesty to every deal. Call Greg at 937-477-8975 today and tell him the Recovery Couch sent you. Yeah, I love that. A lot of lived experience there, Chris, which is one of the better teachers that I've learned when you step into this field of recovery and caring and loving people through active addiction. How do you teach a reprogramming of the mind?
So it's a very simple model. We call it the separation model that we teach, that we are the conscious self. I am awareness, I am energy, I am a decision maker, I'm the experience of life. But what's going on behind me is my mind and physical body. And that my mind and physical body are two different entities, but we're all living in the same, space. And so my mind is my guide, my body is my vessel, but ultimately I'm the decision maker. So we educate to the three parts. Once we have enough education, part of it, you need to think outside the box. And sometimes we'll show the film The Matrix to give like a different sort of take on things. But once we have enough information, then we would make a decision, a declaration of change, and we would write that down. From the signing of that document would then create the separation. Because the moment you make a decision that goes against your mind and physical body, the mind and physical body will come at you. Same as if I hold my breath, my nose and my mouth, within a couple of minutes, my mind and body will override my conscious decision and force me to breathe. It'll, engulf my body with oxygen and then force me to breathe. So there's a mechanism that's going on inside of us that we didn't really fully understand. Same as if I said I'm never going to eat, drink, or sleep again. I can make the decision, but my mind and body will immediately start working against me to try and convince me that it is the right to eat, to drink, and to sleep. So that is the mechanism that we kickstart with a decision that goes against the system. Because once you see the system work against you, then you start to see the evidence of what is going on. So, and just by making a conscious decision, then we start to get the evidence of what's going on. And then we start, because we would have trained the person using a self-talk technique, and with the timelines that we use, after about 10 days, the system then goes dormant of the dependency. So it never, at no point can anyone or anything ever take away your free will. But ultimately, once you've seen that your body's gone dormant of the habit, behavior, addiction, then hopefully you're going to make better choices, that you're going to realize, because once the system goes dormant, you go back into what we call high emotional state, because high emotional state is how we were born into this world. It's only when we take drink and drugs that we go into a lower emotional state, waiting to have another drink. and the perceived highs just going back to what we had. And as the drug runs out, then we go into withdrawal, the voids, the hunger, come back, and we have to sit like that until. So that's the process of how we teach it.
Your program also equips people with tools.
Yeah.
What tools does your program teach?
So the whole program is what we call it self-management. So it's a self-management program of my thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So once we do the separation, once we have communication with the mind, so no matter what emotion comes, emotion, thought, feeling, we're able to, one, to question it, we're able, two, to go back in and change it, and three, have a, almost a better relationship with our inner self. And once you have that communication, you build that relationship, and then ultimately we then start to attract better things into our life. And we want to feel good, but but to feel good you need to do good things. You need to be a good person, because if we're doing bad things, then we get bad feelings, and then we attract more bad things to us. So ultimately we want to be on a good path. And if you don't feel it inside, or you've got trauma, then we've got the ability to go back in, and change things. And the more you change your inner self, the more you get a different result externally. But we spend our whole lives trying to change things externally without doing the inner work. And really, like, if we understand like law of attraction or energy or vibration, we can only vibrate to what we are putting out. Predominantly is how you feel. So however you feel, when I was taking drink and drugs, everywhere I went, there were people taking drink and drugs. It was like I was magnetized to them. But now I switch my mindset off of drink and drugs. I'm not attracted to them. I don't vibrate towards them. And now I'm more attracted to people that don't take drink and drugs. And that's without me making any decisions. It's just, there's, these laws of vibration and stuff like that.
And then I read also in my research that you do a calculation of the cost of addiction. How
Yeah.
do you calculate that?
Well, I mean, there's some calculations you can, and sometimes some that you can't calculate, not in a monetary way. I mean, we just say to people, how much do you spend? Because people don't really recognize how much they spend. But we've been teaching this for over a decade now. So on average, someone that drinks, smokes, uses recreational drugs, and this is recreationally, they're still working and stuff like that. They're probably spending like 20,000, pounds, dollars, on average a year. It's an enormous amount of money, but no one ever, and that doesn't bring into the bad decision making, the relationship breakups, the divorces, the lost jobs, the mental health issues. You can't really calculate that, but on a monetary term, you can definitely calculate that. And some people are into like the hundreds of thousands. I'm going to an event on Monday. It's a professional footballer or goalkeeper. I think he spent like, I don't know, 2 or 3 million in his lifetime on gambling. Which is, again, even though it's not a substance, it's still a release of dopamine when he wins. The mind says, "Oh, that was good. Let's repeat." But what the mind doesn't understand is the losses. It only understands fulfillment. So, and it's the same with food. People consume food, but the mind doesn't understand, weight gain, health problems. The mind keeps telling us to keep consuming food without the understanding of the consequence. See, mind and body don't understand illness. It only understands fulfillment. So consciously we have to take more control of our decisions, but the decisions that we're taking control of is what's going on inside of us rather than what's going on outside of us.
Yeah, I love that, Chris. So many different methodologies, the tools, the manifestation, plugging into the mind, attracting health and wealth as opposed to drinking and drugging. I got a question for you. Um, Final question. So, say there's somebody who just got released from jail and they're on probation and they were a former drug user and they want to get better. but they don't have any money, they don't have a job, they don't have a home, they don't have a driver's license, and all the odds are stacked against them. Where do you start with this person? How do you encourage them, and what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, immediately I would say anyone that's ever been involved in drink and drugs has an entrepreneurial mind. People think, the things that I've done, no one's going to, who's ever going to listen to me and stuff like that. And I felt the same, to be honest, before. But what you need people need to realize is to sustain a drug problem, or criminality or whatever. You've had to learn to understand people, money. You've had to learn to duck and dive. You certainly have to understand and manage multiple things all at the same time. So if you take that skill set and remove it from an addiction and put it into like a business model, then they're already equipped. It's almost like they've got this common sense already, how to build, create, survive, because that's what running businesses are. So rather than thinking that you've got to go in and have employment and be judged and stuff like that, I would say to people, think about something that you want to do, something that would make you happy. It might be helping people. As I said, like we've got like a free program on our charity website, robhillfoundation.org. We can repeat it in a minute. But you can come and learn this program. And if you think the program makes sense to you, then you could get in touch and we could talk about how you could learn how to coach it. And then you could build a career as a coach, and then you can go and coach communities, people. There's so many people struggling. There are millions and millions of people, and even though people know that they're struggling, they're too frightened to reach out. There's too much judgment. There's too much stigma. And a lot of this is hidden. No one really wants to talk about it. So the more someone can heal themselves, the more you become the beacon that it creates the light which attracts the people that are looking, will then attract to you, and you can facilitate that help. And whether you do it as a paid, you do it as a charity, it really doesn't matter, as long as because the best person to ever help someone out of a mental health or addiction problem is someone that's been through it themselves. It's called lived experience. It's not from a textbook. This is the raw understanding of what I went through, what's happened to me, how I've got out, and now what I'm doing now. Do you know? And that's so keep going. Try not to think of the judgment. Just especially once you get control of your mindset, that the world has infinite possibilities for everybody. So
Yeah, I
yeah.
love the hope in that message. You can make a career out of this, helping other people. You could become a mentor, you could become a counselor, you could become a coach. And so there is light at the end of the tunnel, is a phrase that we commonly use. Why don't you tell the listeners where they can go find you? You mentioned thefoundation.org. Plug that, plug your website and your coaching program.
Yeah. So yeah, all of our charity work is done. I set up a charity for my twin brother Rob. So in the memory of my twin brother Rob. So it's robhillfoundation.org. So robhillfoundation.org. There you can get our free 7-day plan. There's a support group online, and you can call us and you can speak to us, and we can have conversations. If you're looking at coaching, then we have beatmyaddictions.com, and there's information there on how you could become a coach and train to deliver the program, if that's something that interests you. And again, you can just get in touch with us. And it doesn't matter that, wherever you are in the country, in the world, we want to help, we want to train, we just want to help as many people as we possibly can. And the other thing is, we're not in conflict with anyone or anything. Religious beliefs, I don't know, different kind of recovery programs. There's a space for everybody, including whatever people's faiths and everything is. We all need faith in something. Otherwise, what's the point? What is this all about? We know that we're here for a life experience. At the beginning, we thought we could just do whatever we wanted, but now we understand that, it's better to be on a good path, a spiritual path, a happy path. Life's still not easy, but it's a lot better, when you realize drinking drugs is not going to get you there. It was a false vision that was sold to us. We're all going to be millionaires. We're all going to be gangsters. We're all going to, have the nice cars and that. It's not true. That, true happiness comes from within. It's something that you create, and that's what we need to get back to. Like you create your own happiness. It doesn't come from out here, and then whatever comes from out here is just a bonus. And so we should all be living, a very spiritual, happy life.
RobHillFoundation.org, BeatMyAddictions.com. Go and check out what Chris and his team are doing. It's fantastic work. They're doing unbelievable things, helping people, loving people, and we would love for you to support that mission. So thankful for you, Chris, for coming on the show, sharing your wisdom and your life experience. Just very, very grateful for you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. And remember, you always have a seat right here on the Recovery Couch. This episode of the Recovery Couch is brought to you by JB Davis at South Dayton Toyota. For integrity, service, and unbeatable deals, call JB and his team at 513-267-5225 and tell them the Recovery Couch sent you.